It's that long tube that allows food to pass through the body. Remember, you're donut-shaped or torus-shaped. You're not a bag of enzymes or cells. And we are concerned in this section with the parts of that tube. As you pass through the tube, the walls change shape a little bit. It's segmented. And we give sections of that tube different names. You've seen the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestines, and the rectum in lab. Those are the major parts of the GI tract. Those digestive organs are really responsible for the passage of food. Passage, churning, breakdown of food. But there are accessory structures, like you already know, that secrete enzymes, that secrete fluid, that facilitate passage through those structures. So while the gallbladder, for instance, or even the liver aren't responsible for digestion in the GI tract, they are heavily involved in proper function of the GI tract. They're accessory structures. They do contribute to food processing. So we're going to look at these major structures in a little bit of depth from the point of view of what structure supports the function of digestion. That's where we're going with this. So if we return to this overview, there are a lot of organs here, and we will emphasize some of them in detail, some of them in less detail. The point that we want to get across in this section is trying to understand the physiology of digestion, what that process means, and how these structures, whichever structures happen to be important, support that process. So digestion, when I think of it, is the erosion, the sequential breaking down of foodstuff from larger to smaller pieces. So how do we break down food into a form that's usable and then put it to use? That's really the point of the digestive system. It's in the name, digestive system. So we'll highlight the roles of some accessory organs in supporting digestion. We'll highlight the main organs in digesting food proper as we go through the system as a whole. But overall, we can outline at least 6 major functions of this system. Digestion probably being paramount and most important. And there's not much to be added to some of these names. The book will go through a small paragraph for you. Ingestion being one function of the digestive system is fairly self-explanatory. You need to put food into contact with the system in order to be able to digest food. In order to be able to have the major organs process that food. But ingestion as a function of the digestive system is, in and of itself, it's a standalone. That's pretty much it. Ingestion of food. Very self-explanatory. That usually only happens in one place, whereas secretions happen immediately and continually throughout the digestive system. So secretions are there to help with passage of that foodstuff, to help with mixing of that foodstuff, and with breakdown. Another word for digestion. So immediate and continued washing of that food. And it's to the order of 7-8 liters per day that your digestive system will secrete to help process the food that you take in. It's a fairly significant amount of fluid and enzymes to secrete. Motility here describes the physical process of moving food through the digestive system. The physical mixing, churning, and then incremental movement of food through the system from one organ to the next until it's eliminated. Now for my money, I think the majority of our weight, our discussion will be on digestion. Digestion isn't only a one-stop shop. It does happen throughout the digestive system, depending on the secretions, depending on the enzymes. It happens throughout. But the majority that we'll explore, we'll see, happens in the small intestine. I suppose that's not exactly true. The majority we'll see happens, I'm not going to say where it happens. It does happen throughout, and I'm going to leave it at that. Digestion, depending on which type you're focused on, and I'll break that down on the next slide, happens right away, happens in the stomach, happens in the small intestine, might even happen in the large intestine, if you subscribe to some recent theories on food hormones and the microbiome. Digestion happens throughout. Absorption is what I was thinking of, that happens mainly in the small intestine. The largest surface area of the digestive system, most sites for exchange of nutrients, and the largest ability to take up small nutrients or substrates to be used within the body. So digestion is the point. Absorption really puts the digestive system to work. Without absorption, we wouldn't have the ability to harness energy from the food that we take in. And then anything that's left over is released. Defecation describes that process of eliminating substances that aren't required by the body. Some things can't be used. Fiber is a great example. We don't have the enzyme that can break down fiber, and so it passes through. Some cells in the GI tract are sloughed off and removed. Some bacteria are removed. Anything that's not required is eliminated through defecation. So, 6 processes, if you're being really specific, but the digestive system focuses on digestion. It's not the motility system. It's not the secretion system. It's the digestive system. Now, digestion really occurs in 2 parts, or 2 forms. You can think of mechanical digestion as physical breakdown of food structure. Chewing, churning, mixing, squishing, compression, even heat in some cases will affect the physical structure of the food you take in. Mechanical breakdown helps to give access to the secretions and enzymes that perform the chemical digestion. Chemical digestion describes the breakdown of the molecular bonds in food, which you could argue is still a physical structure. It's at the microscopic level. You can't see chemical digestion occur. Chemical or enzymatic digestion, largely due to the action of enzymes. You saw that in lab this week. The digestion of proteins, fat, and carbohydrates, all due to enzymes. The proper lock and key, fitting a protein around a structure that needs to be broken, either through cleavage, mixing, dissolving the substance at the molecular level. So in all of these cases, bigger to smaller, fairly evident how these describe digestion as a process. I'm going to focus also on absorption as a secondary major role of the digestive system, because without it, we don't reap the benefits, we don't reap the investment of this system. Without absorption, the energy, the nutrients sit in the GI tract and themselves will be eliminated. It's only because we're able to absorb those nutrients or those molecules that we can put food to work, building larger tissues, repairing cells, and growing. So absorption is harnessing nutrients or energy through the processes of active transport, passive diffusion, osmosis, and we'll talk about those and how they result in the movement of these nutrients in turn when we get there. So mechanical and chemical breakdown, absorption, these describe those processes. This is where I want your mind to rest in this section. Let's start our trip through the system bypassing a couple major points. We're not focusing so much on tooth structure, the hard palate, nervous innervation of the jaw or muscles of mastication. We are going to start with the idea that food is chewed and mixed, that we create a bolus, and that we pass it off through the esophagus to the stomach for processing. We're bypassing the initial mechanical breakdown that you observe at the teeth by chewing with the mouth. So if you create this bolus of food, and at this point it's called a bolus. Food is mixed completely with saliva. If you ever have eaten something and spit it back out again and you get that goopy mess, that's a bolus of food. In order to get it where it needs to go to be digested and processed, you need to swallow. The process of swallowing is deglutition, fancy scientific word, swallowing. Acts or occurs in 3 stages. The first is controlled by you, or the voluntary stage. The last 2 are involuntary, one being the pharyngeal and 2 being pharyngeal and 3 esophageal, both involuntary phases of swallowing in the body. So if we have food that's modified by chewing, by the teeth, this clumpy mess of food, how do we get it from the mouth into the stomach? Largely through the action of the tongue, which you can see here as a cross-section. It takes up a fair bit of room in the mouth. The tongue helps to position the bolus of food so that teeth can chew it. And then when you're ready to swallow, it moves it towards the back of the throat. You know the oropharynx from lab. And there are sensors in the oropharynx that detect stretch, detect the push of that bolus of food on the soft palate as it moves towards the back of the throat. And it's the job of those sensors to relay to the medulla to contract and close off the soft palate so that you don't swallow up, so that you don't have food, fluid, or any of that bolus move up into the nasopharynx. So stretch receptors in the oropharynx send signals to the medulla that close off that passage. Now the action is aided by, again, the tongue. So the soft palate moves up to close off this passage, and you can see the tongue here as you swallow pressing up against the soft palate to help seal the nasopharynx. At this point, those signals will also close off the epiglottis. We saw that, which caps off the pharynx, prevents food from going into the lungs, down the trachea. As the bolus of food moves down through the pharynx into the esophagus. Notice the esophagus in both cases posterior to the trachea. And this handoff signals a transition from the pharyngeal to the esophageal stages of swallowing. So voluntary, pressing up against the roof of the mouth and moving food into the pharynx. Pharyngeal is the movement of food through the pharynx to the esophagus. And esophageal we'll see on the next slide. So gross structures of the mouth we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on. But this process of swallowing will follow through to the deposition in the stomach, at which point we'll call it for today. So this is fully involuntary. You can't stop the movement of food once it's started. You can choose to swallow or not, but after you move it into the pharynx, it's on its way to the stomach, and you have nothing to say about it. This movement through the esophagus is the result of peristalsis. You've seen this term already in lab. The rhythmic, wave-like contraction of muscles in the esophagus. This is analogous to squeezing the tube of toothpaste from the bottom, right? Like you're supposed to. The circular muscles around the esophagus will constrict, squeezing the esophagus closed immediately superior to the bolus, pinching it downwards, if you will. So from the bottom of the tube of toothpaste up, we're pushing the bolus towards the stomach, and at the same time, the longitudinal muscles that are in line with the esophagus will contract. It's a lot like pulling on the sleeve of your jacket. The walls pull up as you slide the bolus through the esophagus. And 1 and 2 will repeat over and over again until you gradually move that bolus of food completely down through the esophagus and it's deposited in the stomach. Circular pinching, longitudinal contraction, and movement of the bolus downwards through the esophagus. Last point, once you reach the stomach, there's a gate. The esophagus is closed. It's separated from the stomach by the lower esophageal sphincter, which is really good because that prevents anything in the stomach from coming back up into the esophagus. If you've ever had heartburn or acid reflux, you know it's not a nice, pleasant feeling. So that sphincter, which is closed, normally needs to open. It relaxes, allows the bolus of food to pass through. And at which point after it's passed through, it closes again to prevent reflux of the contents of the stomach back upwards. The entire process for solid food might take 3 to 4 seconds. Liquids, a second. So while it sounds deliberate, and these steps are repeated over and over again, in practice it's quite quick. So we'll leave it here. You know what happens in the stomach because you saw in a test tube some of those reactions in lab this week. We'll pick that up in class on Tuesday. And don't forget that Monday's your last day to drop the course. I'm not encouraging you to, but just be aware.